Somewhere in a filing cabinet in a police station in Lancashire, there was a piece of paper. It had been read. It had been logged. It had been assessed. The document recorded that a man named Paul O'Hara had told someone, in plain language, that he would kill again rather than go back to prison. That document existed on the 1st of March, 2014, on the 17th of March. 2014, 16 days later, Paul O'Hara killed again. He did it in broad daylight. He did it on a residential street. He did it while 2 police officers stood inside the house he had just walked into. This killer fooled everyone twice. And the most disturbing part of this case is not what he did. It is what was already known about him before he did it. Paul O'Hara had already served a life sentence for murder. He had been assessed by prison psychologists as displaying traits of psychopathy. He had been formally rated as posing a serious risk to women. All of that was in the file. All of that was documented. And in April 2012, after 13 years in prison, the system opened the door and let him walk out. What happened next is not a story about a monster no one saw coming. It is a story about a monster everyone saw coming, and the chain of decisions, assessments, reports, and phone calls that failed to stop him anyway. Stay until the end. A forensic psychologist chose Paul O'Hara as the subject of her university dissertation on psychopathy. What she concluded and when she concluded it is one of the most unsettling details in this entire case. But to understand how a documented threat becomes a body on a street with officers present, you have to go back 16 years. Back to a town in Greater Manchester. Back to a young woman walking to a bus stop at 6:30 in the morning, 400 yards from her parents' front door. Her name was Janine Waterworth. She was 21 years old. And she never made it to work. Janine Waterworth was 21 years old and living the kind of life that doesn't make headlines until something breaks it. She had grown up in Durker, a residential area of Oldham and Greater Manchester terraced streets, close neighbors. The kind of community where people knew each other's routines without having to ask. She had moved out for a while into a shared flat with a man named Paul O'Hara. Then she had made a decision. She ended the relationship and went home to her parents. Back to her own street. Back to the house she had grown up in. It was, by any measure, the right thing to do. Every morning she walked to the bus stop to get to work. The route was familiar. The distance was short. Her parents' home was 400 yards from the alleyway she passed through. 400 yards is nothing. It is the length of a street. It is the distance a person covers in under 2 minutes without thinking about it. She had done it countless times before. Paul O'Hara had grown up in the same general world, Haywood, Greater Manchester, the same post-industrial landscape of mill towns and terraced housing that produced a particular kind of insularity. He was 27 in 1998. He had a history of violence toward women that preceded Janine, prior convictions the 2019 inquest would later confirm. He drank. He used drugs. He had what the court heard described as a personality disorder, and he had been running on drink, drugs, and days without sleep in the period leading up to what he did. None of that was hidden. None of it had been enough at any prior point to interrupt the pattern. When Janine left, O'Hara did not accept it. That is the clinical way of saying something that has no clinical version. He had decided that her leaving was not permitted. He knew where she lived. He knew the route she walked. He knew the time she left. He had been inside that life, the morning routine, the bus stop, the alleyway, and when she removed him from it, he used what he knew. He did not make threats in the days that followed. He did not make scenes. There was no escalating series of incidents that might have caught someone's attention. He was simply quiet. And then he was not. What the court heard about O'Hara at the 1998 trial, the personality disorder, the drink, the days without sleep, would be presented as context for what he did. A way of explaining, if not excusing, the events of that morning. Those same details would resurface years later in a very different context, when a different set of people tried to decide what to do about him. That decision and what it cost is the second half of this story. But first, the alleyway in High Crompton. The morning of the attack. The neighbors still asleep. A 21-year-old woman leaving her parents' house for the last time. And a man who had been waiting. The morning of the attack was ordinary in every way that mornings in Oldham in 1998 were ordinary. Terraced houses. Street lights still on. The particular gray of an English morning before the working day has fully started. Janine Waterworth left her parents' house and began the walk she had made countless times before through the streets of High Crompton. Toward the bus stop, toward work. She never reached it. Paul O'Hara was already in position. He had chosen the alleyway between Great Meadow and Trent Road, a narrow passage near her parents' home, dark enough, enclosed enough, the kind of space a person moves through quickly without looking. He had not arrived there by accident. He had thought about the route. He had thought about the time. He had been waiting in that alleyway before she left the house. When Janine entered it, he was already there. What happened next lasted seconds and left marks that would take years to fully measure. He grabbed her. He stabbed her 12 times with a carving knife. Neighbors heard agonizing screams that pulled people from their sleep. By the time anyone reached the alleyway, it was already over. Janine Waterworth was found in a pool of blood, 400 yards from her parents' front door. The attack had stopped only because the blade of O'Hara's knife snapped off inside her body. He walked away from the alleyway and went to find people he knew. Within hours of the attack, before his arrest, Paul O'Hara told relatives what he had done. Not in the language of a man who had snapped, or panicked, or lost all control, but in the language of a man who already understood the consequence of what he had just chosen. "I think I have killed Janine," he told them. "I can't believe I've done it. I just lost it." That last sentence would do a great deal of work in the months that followed. At Manchester Crown Court in 1998, Paul O'Hara pleaded guilty to murder. The court heard about the personality disorder, the drink, the days without sleep. It heard about a man who had been in a deteriorated state at the time of the killing a man whose judgment had been compromised by factors that, taken together, offered a partial account of how someone arrives at an alleyway at 6:30 in the morning with a carving knife. The account was partial because it was incomplete. It explained the state he was in. It did not explain the waiting. It did not explain the choice of location. It did not explain the fact that he had positioned himself in that alleyway before Janine left the house, before she could have done anything, said anything, or given him any reason in that moment to do what he did. She had not confronted him. She had not sought him out. She had simply walked into an alleyway on her way to work. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. In England and Wales, a life sentence for murder carries a minimum term, a tariff set by the judge, after which the prisoner becomes eligible for parole. It does not mean what most people assume it means. It does not mean the person will spend the rest of their life in prison. It means they will spend a defined minimum period there, and then their case will be reviewed. Paul O'Hara's case was reviewed. In April 2012, after serving approximately 13 years, he was released on life license. Life license is not freedom. It comes with conditions. It comes with supervision. It comes with probation officers who have the power, the legal power, the documented power, to return a person to prison if the conditions of that license are breached. It also comes with an assessment. Before O'Hara left prison, the people whose job it was to evaluate him did their job. They assessed him. They reached conclusions. Those conclusions were written down. He was assessed as displaying traits of psychopathy. He was assessed as posing a serious risk to women. And then the door opened, and Paul O'Hara walked out into Lancashire. Paul O'Hara did not disappear quietly into the prison system. The professionals who assessed him reached the same conclusion. Prison psychologists identified psychopathic traits. Risk assessments repeatedly described him as a serious danger to women. His violent history, including offenses committed before the murder of Janine Waterworth, was already well documented. Even so, Paul O'Hara was released on life license in April 2012 after serving around 13 years in prison. A life license exists to protect the public. It comes with strict conditions, close probation supervision, and the power to send an offender back to prison the moment those conditions are broken. The system had the power to stop him, but it never did. After his release, O'Hara settled in Haywood, Greater Manchester. He was 41 years old when he met Cherylee Shennan. Cherylee was 40 years old. She was a successful businesswoman who owned a furniture store and a beauty salon in Lancashire. She was also a devoted mother. Friends described her as kind and generous. When O'Hara appeared to need help, she offered him a job. What began as an act of kindness slowly turned into something much darker. Detective Superintendent Eddie Thistlethwaite would later describe O'Hara as a predator. He manipulated vulnerable women by exploiting their need for love and attention. Over time, he became increasingly jealous, possessive, and controlling. Cherylee's family watched the relationship become more frightening with each passing month. Eventually, they knew they had to call the police. On the 1st of March 2014, family members reported that O'Hara had violently assaulted Cherylee. He broke her nose. He fractured her jaw. When officers arrived, they found Cherylee terrified. She feared what O'Hara would do if she cooperated with police. Officers assessed her as being at high risk. But one detail in the report stood out above everything else. Someone told police that O'Hara had openly said he would rather kill again than go back to prison. Those words were recorded. They became part of the official file on the 1st of March. Despite everything, police treated the assault as a historic domestic violence incident. No immediate arrest was made. O'Hara was not recalled to prison. Cherylee was not asked to provide a full statement. Family members who had seen her injuries were not formally interviewed. Instead, the case was passed to the Public Protection Unit for follow-up. 16 days remained. On the 12th of March, probation officers learned that Cherylee had suffered a broken jaw. O'Hara still was not recalled. Instead, he was simply told to slow the relationship down. 2 days later, on the 14th of March, his probation officer finally read the police report from the 1st of March. After reading the details, her concern grew immediately. She instructed O'Hara to stay away from Cherylee while further inquiries were carried out. Even then, he remained free. On their own, each decision might seem understandable. Together, they painted a very different picture, a convicted murderer. A man assessed as showing psychopathic traits, a known danger to women, accused of another violent assault. reported to have threatened to kill again rather than return to prison. Yet he was still allowed to remain free. Then came the 17th of March. Cherylee contacted probation herself. She confirmed everything her family had reported. She said O'Hara had assaulted her repeatedly. She said she was terrified. The probation officer immediately contacted police. According to the call record, she warned officers that Cherylee feared for both her own life and the safety of her daughter. She made one thing clear: we need to get him arrested. Police classified the incident as requiring an urgent response. Armed officers wearing stab vests and carrying pava spray were expected to arrive within the hour. More than an hour passed. Instead, 2 domestic violence officers arrived. Neither officer wore a stab vest. Between them, they carried only a single baton. They entered Cherylee Shennan's home on Hardman Lane in Rawtenstall. They sat down. They began taking her statement. Then, the back door opened. Paul O'Hara walked inside. He was holding a hammer. He had come in through the back, not through the front door where the officers were standing, not in a way that gave anyone in that room a moment to prepare. He had come through the back of the house, the way someone comes when they have already decided what they are going to do and they do not want to be stopped before they do it. He was carrying a hammer. Once inside, he took a knife from the kitchen. The 2 officers, no stab vests, 1 baton between them, were now in a house with a convicted murderer who had told someone 16 days earlier that he would kill again rather than go back to prison. Cherylee Shennan was in the same room. Her daughter existed somewhere in the geography of that afternoon. And the system that had been managing Paul O'Hara, supervising Paul O'Hara, documenting Paul O'Hara's risk for years, had sent 2 people with a baton to stand between him and the woman he had already broken. Cherylee ran. She made it out of the house and into the street Hardman Lane. Rawtenstall, the middle of the afternoon, an ordinary residential road. O'Hara followed her. He caught up with her outside her own front door and stabbed her repeatedly. The officers pursued him. They could not stop it. Cherylee Shennan collapsed on the street outside her home and was pronounced dead at the scene. A post-mortem examination confirmed she had died from multiple stab wounds. Paul O'Hara was arrested nearby a short time later. He did not resist. There was nothing left to resist for. On the 30th of June 2014, at Preston Crown Court, Paul O'Hara pleaded guilty to the murder of Cherylee Shennan, to the Section 18 wounding of Detective Sergeant Damien McAllister, to the assault of Detective Constable Karen Kenworthy. He entered those pleas without contest. The judge gave him a whole life order, not a life sentence with a minimum term, not a tariff after which his case would be reviewed. A whole life order, the most severe sentence available in England and Wales, reserved for cases where the court has determined that no minimum term is appropriate because no minimum term could be sufficient. It means exactly what it says. Paul O'Hara will die in prison. He was the first person in England and Wales to receive a whole life order for a second murder after having already served a life sentence for a first. Close the loop from Module 3. In 1998, the court heard about the personality disorder, the drink, the days without sleep. It accepted a partial account of a man in a deteriorated state. That account left a door open, the door through which, 14 years later, Paul O'Hara walked. In 2014, the court did not leave that door open. The whole life order was the judicial system's way of saying that whatever the 1998 court had decided, the 2014 court was deciding something different. There would be no review. There would be no license. There would be no next time. There had already been a next time. And it had happened with 2 officers present, with a documented threat in the file, and with a unanimous jury finding delivered 5 years later, in 2019, that the failure to recall Paul O'Hara had contributed to Cherylee Shennan's death. The question the inquest could not answer is the one this case will not let go of. Everyone who encountered Paul O'Hara in a professional capacity came to the same conclusion. Not the people who loved him, or trusted him, or gave him jobs and relationships and the ordinary materials of a second chance. The people who evaluated him. The prison psychologists. The risk assessors. The forensic psychologist named Sarah Simpson, who found Paul O'Hara so clinically significant that she chose him as the subject of her university dissertation on psychopathy. They all reached the same conclusion. And they reached it early. The pattern, looked at in full, is not difficult to read. It only looks difficult in retrospect because of how effectively O'Hara managed the distance between what he showed people and what he was. He was not, by the accounts of those who knew him socially, an obviously frightening person. He was someone who identified what a person needed and provided it attention, employment, companionship, until the moment they attempted to withdraw it from him. At that point, the provision stopped and something else began. With Janine, it was a knife in an alleyway before dawn. With Cherylee, it was a hammer through a back door in the middle of the afternoon. Both times, he had made the decision before he arrived. Both times, the location was chosen. Both times, the weapon was brought or sourced in advance. This was not rage that overrode planning. This was planning that produced rage as its instrument. Psychologists who study this profile describe it as predatory coercive control, a pattern in which the violence is not the loss of control, but the reassertion of it. The relationship is the mechanism. Intimacy is the access point. And when access is threatened, when the woman attempts to leave, to report, to withdraw, the response is not impulsive. It is calculated. It arrives through the back door with a hammer because that is where it is least expected and hardest to stop. Sarah Simpson at the 2019 inquest confirmed what her dissertation had concluded years earlier. O'Hara had a history of drugs, alcohol, and violence against women. He displayed traits of psychopathy. He was, in her clinical assessment, exactly what the prison risk assessors had said he was. The knowledge was there. It had always been there. This is what makes the case of Paul O'Hara different from most cases that carry the label of monster. The system did not fail to identify him. It identified him precisely, documented him thoroughly, and then made a sequence of decisions release, slow down the relationship. Stay away while we investigate that treated the documentation as background rather than instruction. He told someone he would kill again rather than go back to prison. That was written down. That was read. And the question the 2019 inquest jury answered unanimously that the failure to recall him contributed to Cherylee's death is not the hardest question this case leaves behind. The hardest question is what accountability looks like when a unanimous jury finding produces no criminal consequence for anyone in the chain. Paul O'Hara is serving a whole life order. He will die in prison. That part is settled. Cherylee Shennan's daughter grew up without her mother. That part is not settled by any sentence. Janine Waterworth's family attended the 2014 proceedings. They watched a court give Paul O'Hara a whole life order for a second murder that their daughter's case had not been enough to prevent. Janine's sister Tracy later told the Oldham Chronicle that when she heard about another convicted killer being considered for release, her immediate reaction was, "He'll do it again." She said it about someone else. She had already lived it with O'Hara. Detective Sergeant Damien McAllister and Detective Constable Karen Kenworthy, the two officers who attended Cherylee's home that afternoon with no stab vests and one baton between them, were injured in the attack. Their names are in the court record. What they carry from that afternoon is not. The 2019 inquest jury delivered a unanimous finding: the failure to recall Paul O'Hara after Cherylee's family reported domestic violence contributed to her death. The inquest concluded no criminal charges followed against any individual in the chain of decisions that led to Hardman Lane. The Crown Prosecution Service, the Probation Service, and Lancashire Constabulary all acknowledged failings. Acknowledgement is not the same as consequence. Now, here is the question this case will not answer for you. A convicted murderer, assessed as psychopathic, rated as a serious risk to women, told someone he would kill again rather than return to prison. That statement was written down, read, assessed, and filed. 16 days later, he killed again, with two officers present and a unanimous jury finding that the system's failure contributed to her death. No individual was charged. No individual was prosecuted. So the question is this: at what point does a system failure become something that the word failure is no longer large enough to hold? If this story moved you, give it a like, share it to raise awareness, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to follow more real-life true crime cases.